Welcome back to the DaliTalks podcast. Thank you so much for being here. My guest today is Selene Luna. You might know her as Soledad on FX's Mayans MC, and she's also the voice of Tía Rosita in Disney-Pixar's Academy Award and Golden Globe Awards winner Coco. In 2019, Luna took to Washington, D.C. alongside U.S. Representative Maxine Waters and U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer to advocate for disability rights at a rally on Capitol Hill. Selene is currently featured on Halloween Dragstavaganza with a special A-list musical guest and surprise cameos to delight horror fans. I invited Selene after she and the Passionistas Project's leaders, Amy and Nancy Harrington, had a conversation with her about disability and her activism work. And I felt like this is something that we definitely need to educate ourselves because there are too many misconceptions and stereotypes out there that we need to know for ourselves and also pass on to our children so that they don't end up becoming part of the problem. As you've heard me mention in the past, one of the most targeted groups of that get bullied are people with disabilities. So this is really important to me because the more we understand people's disabilities, the less likely it is that we will just allow it to happen and that we will accidentally or purposely insult or mistreat them. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Selene. Enjoy. Selene, thank you so much once again for making time to come on to the DaliTalks podcast. So give us a little bit of background about who you are, how you grew up, and what you do now.
Well, thank you, Dali, so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Selene Luna, and I am a little person, which means I'm 3 feet 9 inches tall. I was born in Tijuana, Mexico, and I was brought to the United States by my family when I was the age of 3. I was 3 years old, and the reason my parents brought us to this country was really because, for a number of reasons, like most immigrant families, for a better life in general and a better future for their children. However, I was the only disabled child born into this family. And upon my birth, the doctors in Mexico told my parents that they asked my parents if they want, I'm quoting here, if they wanted to keep it. Because back in the day, and this is any country, not just Mexico. I actually have a friend with a disability who was born in London and in the same generation, and he had the exact same experience. So where at the time, children born with disabilities were considered disposable, and parents were generally advised to institutionalize the child and just wait for them to die.
Wow.
So, of course, my parents are not animals. Actually, that's an insult to animals. Animals are more protective of their children than humans are. But my parents, of course, thought that was outrageous. And, they lived an impoverished life in Mexico. And but they knew that they wanted better for their child, especially because of the attitudes they were getting from the medical profession in Mexico. And so that was one of the driving forces to bring their family to the States. So my parents just wanted me to have better medical attention, really, and more opportunities than somebody like me would have in their native country. So we came to America, and I guess long story short, maybe it's too late for that already, but we had a very difficult challenging life as illegal immigrants. We were illegal immigrants. But in the 80s, we did become legal. So that did help our lifestyle tremendously. I mean, our quality of life, not lifestyle. And so my parents were, they were focused on just mere daily survival. And they did everything they could to, to help me with my own personal disability as a little person. But that was challenging. They didn't speak the language. I mean, now they do, but back then, they didn't speak the language. They were alone in this country. They didn't have resources. They didn't have support, and so it was very difficult. Down to I grew up in Los Angeles, and the public school system uh, insisted that my parents place me in special education classes regardless of my intellectual abilities. It was purely based on what I physically look like. And so, and I keep saying back in the day, this was, I grew up in the 70s and 80s.
Mhm.
So back then, children with disabilities were segregated from the general population in the public school system. And, people say, oh, yeah, well, special education. There was no education about it. It was basically all disabled children were, regardless of what their specific conditions were just all clumped together in one holding area out of sight from the general population and just not educated really, just held there. It's like a babysitting prison really. And my parents didn't want that for me. They didn't speak the language. They were not from this country, but they knew that they didn't come to this country so that that would happen to me.
Mhm.
And so they fought tooth and nail, and were able to get me integrated into the general school population. And so that it was a huge accomplishment for my parents. However, I still didn't get the adequate education. I was integrated into the classroom, but I was still the only disabled kid in the classroom and completely overlooked by all teachers. They didn't know what to do with me. Instead of just integrating me into the lessons, I was ignored and still kind of intellectually separated from the other kids. So I had the intellectual ability, but I didn't have the opportunity to develop my critical thinking and excel in academics, which then would have contributed to my independence as a young adult. And so I did not have that opportunity. So that's the background of the adversity I came from. So with that, I decided to go into show business because I do have a very vivid memory as a 5-year-old child. That's about the age where I think children begin to have self-awareness of who they are and their surroundings, and that's when I realized I was different. And growing up in LA, very close to Hollywood, I grew up in the East LA projects, and so Hollywood was 30 minutes away, and it was a huge influence culturally. And so I decided as a little kid that I was going to get into showbiz so that people would stare at me on my terms and they
Mhm.
would have to listen to me on my terms. And that's kind of how that happened. And so flash forward to today. Um, I I am an actress. I'm an actress on a dramatic TV show. I play Soledad on FX's Mayans MC. And to my knowledge, I'm the first Latina little person who has a dignified acting role on a serious crime drama.
Wow. In
And,
2022.
yeah, so there's an
Wow.
earful. It's hard
Mhm.
to give the whole background in a short amount of time.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So I have so many questions. Well, to begin with,
Mhm.
as you were telling the story of how you were integrated into the classroom and you were not really given a proper education, you were just pretty much babysat, right? Were there
Mhm.
any moments where you try to challenge yourself? And if so, how did the educators react to that?
That's a very interesting question because I know that in my belly I felt something was wrong. Like I knew it was wrong what I was experiencing because when I compared the school experience to my siblings, it wasn't the same for me, and so I didn't like that feeling of unfairness. And then, as it was, my parents sacrificed so much just so we could have what we had. And the last thing I wanted to be was a burden. I already knew and was made to feel like a burden, and not out of abuse or anything like that. It's just my parents were exhausted and frustrated and sacrificed so much. And so I knew I was a burden on the family, and that affected the daily dynamic. So I held a lot of my what I felt things that I knew were injustice and unfair, and that I was taking the brunt of. I held it in because I felt like I'm already a burden to the family, to the school, to society. I better just keep my mouth shut.
Mhm.
So for those reasons, I didn't challenge anything because I thought if I challenge things, I'm going to be a bigger problem than I am already.
Wow. Mhm.
So I kept my mouth shut and I sucked it in, knowing it was unfair. But this another element to that was that the constant message I received from school, where I spent most of my time, because you're at school all day while your parents are at work. And I was a latchkey kid on top of it,
Mhm.
So my greater influences were the authorities at school, and they made it perfectly clear from day one. I mean, I remember this going back to preschool, that I would never be like everyone else. And so the expectations for me were really low. And so I accepted that as a very young child. So I accepted, don't try, because in the end, you're not going to have access to the same life that everyone else gets. So I also became complacent, lazy and complacent. But I was highly intelligent. I know that's not a humble thing to say, but I say it now because of the frustration I feel over disabled children to this day who are not given the tools to develop their critical thinking. It's not fair. And without that critical thinking, you cannot become an independent, contributing member of society. It's a
Mhm.
systemic problem that holds us back and does not allow us to participate equally in society.
Wow. Yeah. To your point about realizing at such a young age, at preschool age,
Mm-hmm,
that you had that feeling, you noticed what was wrong. You probably didn't have the words to articulate what was going on, but you
mm-hmm,
definitely felt it and saw it. And I want to point that out because I think a lot of parents think, oh, they're too young to notice. They don't really know what's going on, but they certainly do. I know,
mm-hmm,
yeah, I know as a little kid too, I noticed certain things. I remember my first time I noticed gender inequality. I was so little. And
mm-hmm,
I didn't have the words to call it anything. I just knew it was wrong. So I wanted to point that out. And also, the fact that society to this day see a person with a disability and immediately assume that they are intellectually not capable to do so much, it is a problem that we are still fighting against, and that's something that you have been very boisterous about. You have taken up a lot of your time, personal time, to create awareness, which is actually how we met when we were on LinkedIn audio event with the Passionistas, Amy and Nancy Harrington.
mm-hmm.
um, and what caught my attention about that conversation is that you mentioned certain terms that I'd never heard before. And I thought, wow, this is the reason why there's so much ignorance in society about people with disabilities. And this is why people with disabilities are still seen as inferior, and we need to get these terms out there and educate more people. So would you mind if we go over some of them? I have a list of them that we discussed, and I'd like to hear your definition and explain how they came about so that our public becomes informed.
Absolutely, I would love to.
Thank you so much. Okay, so you mentioned inspiration porn. Would
Mm-hmm.
you please explain what that is? Because when I heard that, I was like, what is that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a jarring term to think about. Inspiration porn is a term that was coined in 2012 by a disability rights activist named Stella Young. And sadly she's no longer with us. And she was an incredible, brilliant woman. And I'm sure you can find it if you Google it. She did a great TED talk about this before she passed in 2014. I mean, she passed in 2014. I don't remember the year of the TED talk, but definitely look it up. I think it's worth it. And so, inspiration porn is something that everybody, I mean, just about anyone who's on social media, any social media platform, comes across, and they don't realize they're coming across it. What this generally is you see it a lot in memes or images posted on social media. Inspiration porn is the portrayal of people with disabilities as being inspirational to able-bodied people, like to non-disabled people, on the basis of their life circumstances. So, for example, there's like a photo of somebody, of a wheelchair user weightlifting in the gym, and then with a caption that says, "What's your excuse?" You know, or "Never give up." You know, before you quit, try. Oh, or the commentary is like, "Wow, they're so brave. Oh my God, look at they're so brave," and it's all coming from non-disabled people. Meanwhile, it's the non-disabled people that create the environment that causes us barriers. They are the ones who are making it difficult for us to navigate through daily life. Just in the most practical sense, like being able to open a door. There aren't ramps everywhere. There are more steps than ramps all over the place. And that's just an example of the point I'm trying to make. And the reason, oh God, I lost my train of thought. But basically, the reason Stella Young used the term porn was deliberate, because the use of the term porn deliberately describes the objectification of one group of people to benefit another group of people. Like, disabled people, we're not inspired by each other. There's nothing to be inspired by. We're all in the same struggle, and the biggest struggle for all disabled people is, and I know I shouldn't be making blanket statements, but I think I have enough experience living it where I'm allowed. But the biggest struggle for people with disabilities is not our actual disability. It's it's the non-disabled society's perspective on disability. That is our biggest hurdle. If people could just wrap their heads around the fact that we are not these like angelic one-dimensional beings that are put on this earth to make you feel better about yourself. We have lives that are just as dynamic as anyone else's, and we also are entitled to have the same access as everyone else does, but we don't. We simply are not allowed the same civil liberties as everyone else. And that is an actual fact, a statistical fact. And so that's, anyway, I think I went off on a tangent here, but back to inspiration porn. It is one of the most damaging things in the disabled community, because it perpetuates a misconception of what disability is about, and non-disabled people just continue to stoke that fire. And the truth is, if you're a non-disabled person who's truly, genuinely inspired by a disabled person, you don't sit around posting memes and commenting on social media. The actual definition of the word inspiration means that you have an exhilarating urge to get up and do something. That it is an action. It's not a compliment. So don't sit back and feel good about or guilty about your good fortune. Get up and find out why this makes you feel fortunate. Everyone should feel fortunate, not just you. Do something about it.
You bring so many good points about this, because when I see people comment on those type of posts or memes, I know that a lot of them mean well. They think that it's they're being nice people, but it's almost, if you really think about it, like a double what is it, a
double-edged sword
or backhanded compliment.
Yes,
where it's like, oh, you're not supposed to be doing that, but you are, therefore you get these kudos. It's like a plus for you. And it's just insulting. And I never thought of it that way until I heard you explain that. And I thought, oh my gosh, have I done that? I'm pretty sure I have at one point or another. But, again, it's because we're not educated on that. And we're also taught, even in school, because I remember we had a kid who was in a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And we were almost like encouraged to treat them extra special and extra compliments and, like do all of that for him just because he was in a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And a few years later, we get older, go on to higher grades. I happened to interact with him like one-on-one, and it dawned on me, I'm like, man, this kid is just like me.
Yep.
I don't know why I thought he was so different just because he was in a wheelchair. And I remember him telling me, well, I like to play basketball. And I was like, what? You can play basketball when you're in a wheelchair? And it
Mm-hmm.
was just like that ignorant child, right? That nobody ever taught me. I was never around somebody in a wheelchair. So my perception, my assumption of this child's abilities and also personality was so skewed based off of how the teachers had told all of us how
Mm-hmm.
to interact with this child. And then I look back and I'm like, gosh, that's horrible. I was part of the problem. So that's why we're having this conversation, because I want parents to
Mm-hmm.
educate their children. And also, I'm sure a lot of adults are unaware of this as well. There was also a question that you and I had, well, a conversation you and I had about
Mm-hmm.
the word disability, because
Mm-hmm.
I have, when I have my anti-bullying workshops, I always mention that one of the largest demographics that is always targeted for bullying are people with disabilities. And that's globally, that's not just here in the United States, but if you look
Mm-hmm.
at, the studies, people with disabilities are always the number one that are targeted, and they suffer the most from it. So some of the education I try to bring in is the terms. Some people like to be referred to as a person with a difference. Some people like the word disability. So can you educate us on what is the right term, or what is mostly accepted by the disabled community?
Well, that's a fair question. Everyone's confused about it, including the disabled community. And it just stems from um, generations of uh, disability being viewed by society as the worst possible thing that someone can exist in, as disabled. And so, we are navigating through this, but ultimately, the most empowering to me personally and from the disabled community that I'm involved in is just say disabled. Anything, and there is no debate. Anything outside of saying the word disabled is implying shame. Why dance around it? Why? And we talked about this the other day, but I think it's the perfect analogy because people understand this analogy. It's like referring to someone who is gay as differently heterosexual. Like, you would never do that.
Right.
Like, why? Just call it what it is.
Mhm.
It's like referring to an Asian person as differently Caucasian. It's like, so just call it what it is. The thing is, by just saying the word disabled, you are shutting down all the negative connotation to it, all the negativity around it. Because saying, and I grew up being taught to say differently abled or special needs. There's nothing, special needs could not be more patronizing. It's
Mhm.
like it implies that you're just some weak, delicate, little helpless thing that needs special treatment. We don't need special treatment. We need equality. We need equal access to what you have. You're not doing us a favor. It's our civil liberty. So just say disabled. If somebody, whether they're disabled or not disabled, if they cannot say the word disabled, that's about their own shame and their own discomfort. It's got nothing to do with me, and it's got nothing to do with a disabled person.
I completely agree with that statement, because I've felt that discomfort. And it
Mm-hmm.
comes from a place of like, I don't know if I'm going to insult that person or not if I say this.
Right.
Yeah. Or
And if a disabled person is insulted by it, I know it's difficult to approach when you're not disabled, but for me, I feel if I use it with somebody who is disabled and if they're uncomfortable with it, I will challenge them. What's wrong with being disabled? You know, why? Why? There's nothing wrong with it. I'm proud of my disability because it's made me the person that I am today.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, I sleep very well at night. I'm proud of who I've become.
Yeah. And you know, somebody said this, I heard this the other day, and I thought, I wonder if that's insulting, if it's fair to compare. But somebody said, well, a person who has a disability, such as maybe, you know, they can't walk for some reason, or they're blind. It's no different than somebody who is not able to run really fast. And I thought, is that fair, or is that an insulting comparison? Because we all quote unquote able people are not able to do something, right? Or several things. We just don't point it out because it's not obvious, which is a whole nother conversation of like visible disability versus non-visible disability. So do you think that it would be a helpful comparison if we thought of disabilities that way, where, hey, everybody has something that they cannot do?
No, it's absolutely apples and oranges.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very limited perspective, and also actively close-minded.
Mm-hmm.
Because this isn't about self-esteem or anything's possible or everyone has a tough life. It's not about that at all. For example, somebody who can't run somebody who can't run, who's comparing themselves to somebody who needs an aid to walk, what they're doing is taking up space in an area that does not affect them. The fact that you're not able to run as fast as, whatever you think you should be able to run doesn't make you disabled. It makes you out of shape.
Yeah.
And also it doesn't keep you from climbing stairs.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't keep you from entering a public building. It doesn't keep you from employment opportunities. It doesn't hinder you from discrimination at the university level.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't hinder you from voting. I've had those physical encounters where I couldn't vote because the voting center wasn't set up for somebody with a disability, and even though it's illegal. So that is just garbage, ableist trash. And I'm sorry, I got to put it bluntly, there's no gentle way to approach that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And instead of, why don't you keep your mouth shut and get informed about what we're really talking about, and don't take up space where you don't need to.
Yeah. Thank you so much for answering that. Because when I heard that, I thought, like, that's an interesting way to think about it, but I don't think it's the same thing. But you explained it so much better, because you mentioned, it doesn't stop you from getting fair employment or from walking upstairs. So thank you so much. I had to ask it because I didn't know how to explain it to people, or at least, express my point of view on that.
And I apologize for being overly frank. I'm still trying to navigate this without leading with pain and anger.
Yeah, no worries, because you know what? Having to hear those things all the time has got to be exhausting, and it would probably tick me off after. I mean, you're human. You have the right to be ticked off because you hear this all the time. And also I'm sure that you have experienced this in almost every aspect of your life, which actually this segues into my next question. Since you went into acting, you mentioned something in that conversation I heard about little people having been historically hired onto television or in the entertainment industry only as, I think you said people who work in the circus. Correct me if I'm wrong. Would you elaborate on this? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for asking that question, because as a little person, the level of ableism we experience as little people is on a whole nother level, separate from the general disabled population, because the way we've been looked at and portrayed throughout society, throughout history, in the entire world, is as non-human beings. So disability aside, we're not even considered humans. And Hollywood continues to perpetuate that attitude because we're seen and treated as creatures, not people. Like, I mean, it's shocking to me that we're in 2022 and little people are still by far portrayed on television and in films in every country as creatures like monsters and elves and just non-human enchanted forest beings and just faceless creatures inside costumes. And everybody always tries to challenge me with, well, what about Peter Dinklage? What about Peter Dinklage? Okay, I really respect and admire Peter Dinklage, but why is it that we are only allowed one heterosexual white man to represent an entire community of people? What if Jackie Chan was the only Asian allowed in any television show or film to represent the entire Asian population? It's like, why is that okay? It's not dignified to be represented as non-human creatures in pop culture. And the reason it's so important is because the media controls popular culture. And so what you see on TV and films, in print ads, is what people take as a representation of a group of people. So then when we are not seen as human beings, we get bullied by society because we don't have feelings, we don't matter, we're not real people. So that's where that's why dwarf tossing exists, or midget tossing, whatever they call it. That's why that exists.
Wait, what is it?
Oh, dwarf tossing?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, this is a real thing. You should I encourage anyone listening who's never heard about this to Google it. It is an actual sport, and I'm using legitimate in quotes. It is a legitimate sport where men go into a boxing ring, pick up a little person and toss them.
Wow.
Dwarf tossing is an actual sport. And since little people don't have income and employment equity, they are forced to then make a living with these humanizing types of ways.
Wow.
And even when Peter Dinklage, I forgot what year it was, but the year he won the Emmy, look up his Emmy speech. He spoke about this. He's a huge advocate against dwarf tossing. And he spoke about it because that year, a little man was killed or paralyzed. I think he was paralyzed as a result of dwarf tossing. And absolutely no one was held accountable. He lost his ability to walk. He lost his livelihood. And I believe he ended up dying. I might be wrong, but something like that happened. So, God, I can't remember how we got to this place. I forgot the question. I apologize.
The question, it's okay. Because I asked you about what was dwarf tossing.
Oh, right. Yeah. But I forgot why I brought it up. But and anyways, so little people in showbiz. Yeah. So that's an example of how we're exploited for non-disabled people's entertainment. And so I challenge anybody to tell me when's the last time they saw a little person, man or woman, who was not Peter Dinklage, on TV or film that was not in a costume, or some kind of or if they're not in a costume, they're in a prank show as the butt of the joke. In fact, last week I got a phone call, and from a major production company for a major network. I'll say the network is ABC. This is the prank show that's going to air on ABC next year. And the host, there are 3 hosts who are all major household names. And the producer behind this is a huge household name. But I'm going to keep my mouth shut as far as those names go because I want to continue working. But But they called me and they were really excited because they specifically thought of me personally to do this prank show with them. They wanted to know if I would be in a prank where the butt of the joke was simply being a little person. That's it. That's the joke. I'm a little person. That's all that happens. I'm just being myself. I just look the way I do. That is the joke. So of course I told him to go to hell, but that's 2022 and this show's going to air in 2023. I don't know if they're going to move forward with that prank, but that is the mentality. And so me being the first Mexican American little person on a dignified TV show and I play a real person, and on the TV show it's not even addressed that I'm little or disabled at all. It doesn't matter. And so I have this opportunity now and this platform, and it's all because the people behind the show are really evolved and they have a handle on what it actually means to be inclusive. And so I'm very proud to work for them. And this is FX. They're an incredible organization to have given me this opportunity.
Yeah, that's really progressive. It's very different too, and hopefully it normalizes this seeing people, little people on television, because I had to look up who Peter Hinkling is because it's not a name that just you automatically know. And so for those listening, he played
well, I'm sorry to interrupt. He's actually a very well respected the actor who's there has never been a little person who has broken the glass ceiling like he has. He's the star of Game of Thrones on HBO, as well as other major feature film blockbuster films.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so everyone should know his name.
Right. Goldmember. What was that called? I think it was, I can't remember the name of the movie, but yeah. So, cause I looked him up, I was like, oh yeah, I've seen him in so many films.
Yeah. You know the face.
Yeah. Yeah. I know the face. Wow. So, thank you for sharing about that. Cause like that term dwarf tossing, I cannot believe that that's even legal. Because that would totally not be acceptable if it were any other person without.
Exactly. Could you imagine wheelchair tossing?
Right. Like, can you imagine somebody saying they're gonna, right? Like, oh, let's toss Leonardo DiCaprio around.
Right.
Nobody would go for that. What about the term little person? Because I know that there's different terms out there. And so what is the correct term so that we don't insult little people? Because I've heard dwarf, and then of course I know for sure midget is not acceptable, but you and I had a conversation about that, how that's something that people are trying to take back.
Well, so just as my disclaimer, I'm not an academic, I'm not a professor or a researcher. All I can do is share what I believe is the dignified terminology and what my peers, my little people peers agree with, at least from what I've been exposed and what feels right in my heart. So first off, the word midget is horrible. And the reason why, the reason why is because it has a history that traces back to the sideshows of the circus era. That's when people with disabilities and little people were exploited for entertainment. And at the time, the little people were called midgets. And, come see these midgets. And they were pretty much, even though they were paid, they were bought and sold like property. And also treated like garbage and exploited like objects, like non-human beings. And so for example, the most famous little person most people have heard of is General Tom Thumb. He was the biggest and first celebrity in the world ever. He was the first celebrity he was like the Kardashians of the 1800s. He was the first celebrity in the world, but he was a little person who was sold to the circus by his parents at age 4.
Wow.
And P.T. Barnum exploited him and toured him and exploited him. He was given cigars and wine at age 5 just so people can watch. They would dress him up as a little man. And I mean, it is really, he got no education. It's really horrific what happened to this child, but he actually grew up to be the first celebrity in history and made a lot of money, a lot of money. But it was all at the price of his dignity and also at the price of his autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So that is why we don't like the word midget, because it refers back to the days of being bought and sold and exploited through the circus. Now, the term dwarf, it's my understanding that it does cover pretty much all short stature conditions, and dwarf is simply the medical term that is used to refer to somebody born with a short stature condition. And there are hundreds and hundreds of varying conditions. So it's really difficult to pinpoint one term. And I personally prefer little person because I think it just automatically spells out that I'm a person of short stature. And to me, it's a comfortable blanket term that kind of covers everybody with this condition. And so that's what I'm most comfortable with. And people that I interact with are comfortable with both interchangeably with little person and dwarf. But our community does come across some individuals who don't have a problem using the word midget. They justify it by stating that they're taking ownership of it. So, that just simply does not work for me because I want to separate myself from a history that took away the autonomy of people like me.
Yeah.
To me, I don't want to give it any airtime. Mm-hmm. I don't want to keep it alive. There's no reason for it. To me, in my personal opinion, there's nothing empowering about perpetuating something that was oppressive. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather take ownership in using a completely new term that had nothing to do with the circus.
Yeah.
And so that's just my own personal take.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And I did look up the word dwarf, mm-hmm. and it does say a person of abnormally small physical stature resulting from a medical or genetic condition. And it mm-hmm. goes on, it explains further more about it. So that's really good. I had to ask that because I actually had that conversation a while back with several people who somehow we came up with this conversation because there was something on television that posed the whole conversation. And I tend to correct people sometimes and they find me annoying. They're like, you're not supposed to say that word. And they're like, oh, you don't even know. So I had to ask. I'm like, maybe I've been wrong this whole time. But
well, I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I like to inform myself because I know that these conversations do come up, and part of my job is to educate people, when mm-hmm. I have these workshops. And it's important to me that children know about this because we end up socializing our children to think a certain way, and sometimes those ways are so wrong. I mean, we've seen what happens, wars and discrimination, genocide, all kinds of stuff, because people, if you feed a child a certain idea, then they can grow up and do harm, or they can do a lot of good with what they're taught. Mm-hmm. Are there any last examples that you can give us that we should not be practicing when we see a little person?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really happy you asked this because one of the most intrusive things that happens to us, and this happens to all disabled people actually, is we don't get the privacy in public that everyone else gets. For example, random strangers just will come up to you and ask, what happened to you? And it happens on a regular basis. Like I can't leave the house without being approached. And it's so intrusive. And just because someone is disabled or a little person doesn't mean they're on public display for your curiosity. Um, you are not entitled to just ask. You gotta just accept. We're, you do not need to know, and what you think you need to know shouldn't matter to your acceptance of disability. So whether you accept us or not, we exist, and it's not about you, and it's got nothing to do with you. So even if your question isn't aimed at obtaining private medical information, it still interrupts and invades in ways our non-disabled peers ever have to deal with. For example, a couple weeks ago, I was at the DMV, and this non-disabled gentleman, very polite, he was just curious. I was in the middle of my DMV interaction, and this guy comes over and interrupts me and say, excuse me, miss, what should I call you? Do you prefer little person or midget? I was having this debate with my friend, and just goes on and on. And I'm like, I'm in the middle of a DMV interaction. Like, I was in the middle of registering my vehicle. What the hell? But he would never do that to a non-disabled person.
Right.
Never. So, you think you're just being nice. I'm just trying to be nice. It's like, no, you're invading privacy. And so that is really, I think, the point the point I'd like to leave. It's just like, just because somebody doesn't look like you doesn't entitle you to any information from them. And if there's something you're dying to know, go do your own research. We shouldn't have to be responsible for educating our oppressor and making you feel good about the hurdles you put us in. So it's just a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And just respect our autonomy.
Right. And to be honest, right now, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, am I violating that with you by bringing
No, please. I agree to no. I'm participating in a dialogue.
Yeah.
It's one thing if I'm minding my own business in my private life, grocery shopping, and you just randomly come up and start asking me personal questions.
Right. Yeah.
Or
Thank
just
you for clarifying.
Yeah, no. But this is why I like doing podcasts like yours in particular, because it's an opportunity to share information. And I am volunteering to put myself in a public space. So it does not compare at all to what I was referring to with privacy.
Thank you. And I really appreciate it because it's hard sometimes to ask, like, hey, are you willing to have this conversation? Because you never know. Some people might be completely against it. But I'm very grateful that you have volunteered to come on to the DaliTalks podcast and educate our listeners. And of course, that you are a representation, you are Latina, you're a little person, which is huge for your community. And hopefully that's going to change the way that able-bodied people see little people. And hopefully we'll learn more about like what not to do. And also, how can we support you, by the way? Like, how can we support you in your career aside from watching Mayans or going and watching Coco again for like the millionth time, which I won't mind, because you were the voice of Rosita.
Yes.
So before we wrap it up, let's lighten it up a little bit. Would you mind sharing what were some of your favorite moments or memories while working on Coco?
Oh, what a sweet question. I gotta be honest, the entire experience was memorable for me. It was deeply moving and fulfilling to me. Like every day I went to work, I could not believe it was happening because as I shared in the podcast, as I shared where you and I met on Amy and Nancy's show, the reason Coco is so special is because it is the first big Hollywood studio film that cast an all Latino cast. And, Pixar put so much time and energy and I don't know if people realize this. They researched for years. I mean, it took like a decade to make this film because they wanted to make sure that our culture was properly represented, accurately represented, for the beauty that it is, and to make sure there was no exploitation. And so they worked really, really hard to make sure this film was not whitewashed. Um, so that in itself, so to be involved in part of that team and that effort was just so deeply fulfilling to me. Every day was an absolute special treat for me. And our director, Lee Unkrich, he was a big part of my positive experience. He was a very calming, very supportive, very comforting presence. And he really held my hand through it because he wanted to make sure that, you know, it was just a great experience for everybody. And we produced the best possible product to represent the Mexican culture in the most beautiful manner that it deserved. So
Yes.
it's really just all encompassing for me. It's but to, you know what, to boil it down to one specific experience, you know, while we were making the film, you know, none of the actors got the complete script. You only got, while you're recording, you only got your lines because they wanted to keep the whole story a secret.
Oh,
And that's actually pretty common with large studio productions because of hacking,
yeah.
because of the hacking problem online. You know, films get stolen before they're completed. And so that it's really a security measure that's pretty common. And for that reason, I had no idea how the movie, what really happens. I didn't know how the movie ended or where it really, the direction it really took. And so for me, the most memorable experience was watching it the same night that everybody got to watch it at the premiere, and seeing the turns that it took and the ending and how beautiful it was. And I was sobbing and I had no idea it was going to be such a tearjerker. So I came out of there feeling so proud. It was more beautiful than I could have imagined.
I think it was a tearjerker for every single person who watched it.
Yeah.
You know, in my household, it was completely new because we're Nicaraguan, so we didn't have any idea about what the significance of Dia de los Muertos really was about. We
Mm-hmm.
heard, and it's crazy because I grew up in California,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're not practicing that, then you just don't really get it, right?
Yeah.
So it was, I agree. I think that they did a phenomenal job because when I was watching that movie, I thought, oh my God, it is so beautiful. Like
Mm-hmm.
everything about it, you could tell that they put so much heart into each character and all the animation. And as a Latina, it made me proud that the Mexican culture is part of the Latino experience. Though it's
Yeah.
not mine particularly from my country,
Mm-hmm.
it's just one of those things that makes you even prouder to be Latina, you know?
Yep.
So
Yep.
it was amazing. So I can imagine like going down in history saying, wow, I was part of that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's mind blowing to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And what about your current show, Mayans? Any,
Mayans.
yeah,
Mhm.
because
Oh,
it's
I'm sorry,
totally
go ahead.
different, right?
Oh, big time. It's a huge shift. I mean, this is definitely not for kids.
Yeah.
You know, it's a very serious, very dark, and sometimes violent crime show. And but I'm very proud to work on it because of the show creators and the production staff. They got it's really hard to encapsulate all the wonderful things about this team. But, you know, bottom line, it all rolls down from the top. And our show creator, Elgin James, he's incredibly talented, and director, producer, writer, uh, because he himself has his own fascinating story. He grew up in a life of adversity, and so he understands what real inclusion should look like. And so the reason, you know, I'm on the show because it was very important for him to represent somebody with a disability with respect and dignity. And it was his vision that made that happen. And so he's determined, he's when it comes to equality and inclusion, he sets the standard. And this is why this show is so special to me. But on top of the fact that it's brilliantly written, it's a great drama. And it's a drama that takes place around a Mexican motorcycle club. And so there's a lot of my culture enmeshed in it, and it feels very organic to me, and it's very real, and it's it's a crime show, so it's not like you want to aspire to be one of these guys when you grow up, but it's just to show that entertainment's just entertainment,
right?
And why not have Latino actors doing it?
Right, absolutely. Wow. And last question. So for any child that feels right now that they have limitations due to their disability, what advice would you give them, or what inspirational something would you give them?
Well, for children, if there's a child out there listening who's disabled in any way or just feels like an oddball in the world, maybe you might even feel alone in your own home. Just know that there is a world out there that you have the power to tackle in whatever way you choose, but you have to work hard for it. You have to be prepared to rise above all the negative messages that are around you. Just because somebody tells you life is a certain way, or somebody tells you that you can't do a certain thing, there doesn't mean it's a fact. It is up to you to be the architect of your destiny. And specifically, if you're a child with a disability, you have to accept the reality that you have to work harder than your peers. It will be more difficult for you, but that is not a reason to not do it. And you just make the decision to do it. That's all you need to know. And don't listen to any outside voice, because they don't know what they're talking about.
Absolutely. It's very sage advice. Selene, thank you so much for being here with us, for sharing about your experience and giving us all these tips. And also for being part of the entertainment industry, so we can watch you on there and enjoy your work. Any other way that we can support you before we go?
Thank you so much for asking. Honestly, I just by virtue of being invited to speak on your podcast, I feel supported. So I appreciate that very much. And it wouldn't hurt if you watch me play Soledad on Mayans and MC, and you can write to FX and demand more.
Oh, there we go.
So, but in all sincerity, though, the way you could really help the disabled community at large is just in your day-to-day life while you're navigating the world. Let's say you go to your favorite dress shop. It's a little boutique, but you notice that there isn't a ramp to get in the door, or you notice that the door is extra heavy and not accessible. Go in there and ask the owner, why is that? Ask the owner why. Or when you're at the store and you find yourself at the butcher shop and there's a really high counter, ask them, how would you assist somebody with a disability? Why don't you have a lower counter? So you could do things and demand things. Just because you're not experiencing a disability yourself doesn't mean you should be complicit to not allowing others access.
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah.
And then one final thing, I'm sorry I ramble so much. Finally, and most important, I think, is to challenge your local politicians. Challenge politicians at the grassroots level. When somebody's asking you for their vote locally, ask them, what are you doing to make sure everyone has access to what I get? Demand it from your politicians, because we have to make sure that trickles up to Capitol Hill.
Yeah. Very, very sage advice. I love it because I always preach on use the power of your voice, and that's exactly what you're telling us to do. So thank you once again, Selene. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing more of your work.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, and I want to say thank you so much for what you do. It's really important that people like you are out there speaking up for those who can't speak up for themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that you really learned a lot from my conversation with Selene. I had to have her on the show because it's just a conversation that we don't have very often. So please listen to it again if you need to. Share it with others, especially if you know that there's a person out there that really needs to hear this message, because maybe they're purposely or maybe accidentally offending people with a disability. I cannot stress how important this is. I know that I have family members who have a disability, and I firsthand have seen how some people treat them, especially when the disability is not visible, which is a whole nother conversation that we could have. So thanks again for watching. Please share and leave a review if you have some time. It only takes like a minute or two, and I hope that you have an amazing week. Until next time.
Hey, did you like that episode? If you did, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you may be listening and write a review. If you want more tips or some behind-the-scenes videos, make sure to follow my mom at DaliTalks on Instagram. You can turn on notifications for her posts and stories as well. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. See you next time.